So I'm going to focus my comments today on the undemocratic nature and the effects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and this whole web of global governance which has been created by the free trade agreements that have been created up to this time. So first, the very process of negotiating this particular agreement has been very undemocratic. One hallmark of democratic governance is transparency, yet with the TPP, the level of secrecy has been unprecedented. With the TPP, negotiators have been sworn to secrecy. Congresspeople who have seen the text have been sworn to secrecy. Even during the Bush years, the government actually released negotiating text on government websites for interested parties to see and to discuss. And under Bush, Congress was actually involved with the negotiations, but not with the TP. Even our US representatives and senators have been denied access to the text, and when they have been allowed to see it, they're not permitted to take cameras, paper, pens into the room where they read the text or to take notes. And of course, they are all sworn to secrecy, so even though they might be able to look at it, they can't talk about it. So in spite of the fact that we have all been excluded, 600 corporate lobbyists have been granted special status to see, read, comment on, and many times to actually write the text of the agreement. So just on that level, the TPP process has been extremely undemocratic. But we do have an idea what the effects of the TPP will be, because some text has been leaked, including chapters involved with investments and intellectual property rights. And Wikileaks just released the full text of the property rights chapter just a couple of weeks ago, so we can see what the United States has proposed and what our trading partners, how they have reacted. They haven't reacted very positively to the American proposals. But not only is the negotiating process undemocratic, the agreement itself is an attack on democracy. All governments answer the question, who gets to decide? Prior to the American Revolution, the answer was the king. The king was the decider. The Trans-Pacific Partnership and most of the agreements which have come before have answered that question. The multinational corporations will decide. We the people have fought multiple movements to increase the number of people who are involved or who are included in the phrase, we the people. We have engaged in mass struggle to expand the definition of citizen to include former slaves, those who did not own property, women, labor, I should get this one right, LGBTQ people and more. Those struggles continue today, and of course they are going to continue on into the future. Well, the wealthy elites have also fought for democratic rights for property and for corporations. With the enactment of the American Constitution, with its interstate commerce clause, they set up the world's first free trade area, ensuring that local and state laws could not interfere with cross-state commerce. Corporations have been given our constitutional rights through the U.S. court system. For instance, the Southern Pacific Railroad versus Santa Clara County decision in 1886 declared that corporations had 14th Amendment rights to equal protection and due process under law. More recently, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that because corporations are people, that limitations on corporate funding of elections were an infringement on the corporation's free speech rights and were not allowed. But corporations have not stopped just at attempting to get human rights nationally. Internationally, they have induced our elected officials in Washington, D.C. and the capitals of our trading partners to enact these so-called free trade agreements. These agreements have formed a spider's web of corporate decision-making which covers the globe, ensuring that multinational corporate interests' desire to make profits cannot be challenged by local, state, or national governments. If a multinational corporation perceives that their future profit-making ability has been harmed by a local, state, or national change in law or regulation, they can bring an investment state protection suit against a national government for either compensation or to overturn the law. These agreements, enacted one at a time, have in fact been a corporate coup against the democratic decision-making of we the people. NAFTA was the first agreement which included an investor state protection clause. Almost all agreements since then have included this. These suits bypass national courts and are filed in one of two international private courts designed specifically to hear these cases. The most often used is actually run by the World Bank. Unlike American courts, the court process, or I should say unlike most American courts, the court process is secret. The tribunal judges can only rule on the basis of trade rules with no consideration of other factors. The judges are quite often corporate lawyers or lobbyists. In fact, it's not unusual for a representative of a suing corporation to be judged in the next case. One of the first investor state cases involved a Canadian supplier of a key chemical in the MTBE gasoline additive. MTBE is a possible human carcinogen, and when added to water, gives water a turpentine smell. So when MTBE started leaking into California's waters, the state banned its use. While the Canadian supplier was not the manufacturer, it still sued, claiming that its profit-making abilities had been harmed. This Canadian multinational corporation sued the United States federal government because of an action of a state. An American company could not have brought such a suit against the US government. Under investor-to-state protection clauses, only a foreign multinational corporation is allowed to bring such a suit. California was not even allowed to be present in the courtroom to defend its action, but instead had to depend on the US government to defend its interests. And we all know quite frequently that state interests are quite different than federal interests. Recently, Wikileaks released the intellectual property rights chapter text of the Trans-Pacific Partnerships. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned about what's in that chapter, but I want to focus just on one, which is its effects on affordable medicine. I've been HIV positive since 1985. I've been on HIV meds since 1990. Those meds today cost in the area of $31,000 a year. Luckily, I have good insurance, so it's affordable. But for people in low and middle income nations, these are extremely high prices, and they could be a death sentence for people. But what saves them? Well, India saves them. India manufactures and distributes generic HIV meds, price less than $100 annually. More than 100 million people have been able to take care of their HIV, AIDS, infections because of generic drugs. The TPP release text shows a concerted attack on generic drug production in order to ensure the profits of big American multinational pharmaceutical corporations. Patent terms would be extended from 20 to 25 years at least, and greenwashing would be allowed. Greenwashing is the reformulation of existing medicines by, for instance, changing a pill into a liquid gel cap and then relicensing the patent or renewing it. And of course, thereby preventing competition by generics. The WTO has allowed the manufacture of generics even while the patent is in effect for nations where the high cost would result in severe hardship. The TPP would prohibit that manufacture. The TPP also sets up barriers to sharing of drug data. The original manufacturers must prove drug safety. By international agreement, manufacturers of generic may use that original data to prove their safety, but the TPP would prevent drug data sharing, causing each generic manufacturer to go through years of expensive testing before manufacturing could start. And the TP also extends patents over surgical techniques, medical tests, and treatments which have not been patented up until this time. So we need to realize that these free trade agreements represent a corporate coup against democracy itself, and we need to defeat them. We need to defeat the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we need to turn our sights on those agreements which are already in effect and say no. No to corporate trade agreements, no to the corporate coup.
So as mentioned, I'm Mike Losier. I'm an organizer with Portland Rising Tide. Very briefly, Portland Rising Tide is an all-volunteer organization that's committed to climate justice and confronting the root causes of climate change through an anti-oppression framework. So very briefly, climate justice is acknowledging the fact that those least responsible for causing climate change historically are the ones that are going to be left with the burden. And so when we confront climate change, we have to make sure that our work too is not shifting to that burden to those that are least responsible, and that the transition that we do make is just. And so the quote that was shared earlier, I think has particular resonance in kind of the state of the climate right now, and particularly the comment of, "You can't blame us for being impatient." Right now, our climate is at 400 parts per million in greenhouse gases. And we are, in conservative estimates, see us on a track to 4 to 6 degrees Celsius change in prevailing temperatures by the end of this century. And this far exceeds the kind of international consensus on getting us at a 2 degree Celsius change at a minimum, which even at itself is ridiculous because a 2 degree Celsius change is basically a consensus on genocide in the global south, when we already know that 1 degree Celsius change pretty much dooms a lot of peoples in the global south as well. And we're already seeing those effects play out too. And so it's important when we kind of look at the systemic issues and addressing things systemically, that we look at the roles of capitalism as it plays into causing climate change. Particularly when we see the imperatives of capitalism being the production and accumulation of capital, as being kind of a large agitator for the extraction and production of the greenhouse gases that get pushed into our atmosphere. And free trade agreements are basically, they're a legal technology that serves to mobilize society towards the velocity and speed of capital and its accumulation. And of course, this is very much the situation with the TPP. And for this mobilization of society to take place for the movement of capital, this means a deepening of political dispossession as well, the reduction of all barriers for this movement. So it's important to kind of look at the Pacific Northwest right now and the movement of fossil fuels. Right now, there is a proposal between Southern Oregon and British Columbia. There is 5 new coal terminal proposals and 2 expansions of existing ones, which amount to 128 million tons of coal being pushed through this region. Proposals for 3 new oil pipelines that would amount to 1.5 million barrels a day, and a proposal for 6 new liquefied natural gas pipelines, which would result in 11.2 billion cubic feet a day. This pretty much amounts to 7 times the amount of the load out that the Keystone Pipeline would be pushing through. And this is not accounting for the recent proposal at the Port of Vancouver, which is an oil by rail project that is seeking to move 360,000 barrels a day. And the thing is that this is a huge regional push, and largely it's to export to Asian markets, which the TPP would facilitate. And a lot of these proposals are really hard to keep track of. So the ones that I mentioned too are not all the ones that are on the table. There's probably some that I have missed. And that some ports are catching on to kind of like the resistance to this too, where they are updating the infrastructure at the ports without the presence of any kind of proposal, anticipating that eventually that there will be a fossil fuel export proposal kind of landing there. And so these things kind of take place invisibly too, much like kind of these closed door agreements with the TPP. And so how does the TPP facilitate this? One is through a tribunal system in which individual corporations have the power to challenge environmental law, regulations, and court decisions that negatively impact the expectations of profit, or what they call regulatory taking. This is actually not new. In a nuance, it is, but right now there's discussion with the fact that some of the moves that are being made to challenge these proposals through the permitting process, or even just the use of the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, or a Marine Mammal and Protection Act. These protections have already been rolled back a bit by the WTO. And around the kind of permitting, the delays around projects with LNG and coal, the permitting process and the delays associated with that, there's been discussion that this is a violation of the WTO treaty as well. And so what we see is an environment that's being created that privileges less protections and a race to the bottom to move these fossil fuels through our region. And so in challenging this too, what we've seen kind of recently in confronting these fossil fuel projects is attempts in utilizing the regulatory structure to kind of slow things down. Some people refer to this as paper wrenching, so to speak. But increasingly though, as we see kind of with the TPP, we see the conflation of the interests of capital with the public interest. There is a U.S. Natural Gas Act that requires environmental and economic review before moving projects on fracking, which some people have successfully used to kind of slow things down, going through the environmental review, making sure that people are engaged in a process to determine whether these projects happen or not. But if these projects are expected to be used for exports, and it's part of and if it's a free trade agreement country, these protections are basically canceled because it's assumed to be at the public interest. And so one thing we have to keep in mind is when we engage the regulatory structure and the protections that we have, that this is an evolving legal landscape that increasingly reflects the interests of capital. The more the regulatory structure and protections succeed in preventing harmful and unjust projects, the more corporations learn how to undermine it. And they have done that. They pressure politicians who then pressure the EPA and other state protection agencies, threatening cuts to budgets and stuff to make changes and creating barriers for people to kind of engage that process. And the TPP and the free trade agreements are kind of like a perfect representation of this too, and how they've kind of evolved. And they couldn't get everything with the WTO, and so now they're kind of going with this other strategy with these docking agreements in the TPP. And so when we engage the regulatory structure, we have to make sure that it's not becoming a means to manage opposition. And so it's important that while at kind of like the legal level, there's this push to mobilize society through legal structure and this kind of deepening of what or this determination rather of what kind of relationships we have with each other, with our labor and our environment, that we mobilize resistance in the opposite direction, that instead asserts the fact that we get to decide and the kind of relationships that we want with our environment. And this is expressed in acts of civil disobedience and direct action, which is growing in the Pacific Northwest in response to these projects. And so it's important that we not only defy laws that we feel that are unjust, but also insert and act relationships that we feel are just. Because to make a just transition, we also have to make sure that we are kind of creating these relationships that we feel are more in our interests. And direct action has had success in previous in disrupting trade agreements before, in 1998 with the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, 1999 the Millennial Round in Seattle at the WTO, 2003 Free Trade Area of the Americas in Miami. In 2013 there was protests in Vancouver, BC over the TPP. And there's been active resistance in indigenous territories as well. There's an active blockade in Wet'suwet'en territories in British Columbia to a pipeline project. It's called the Minnestoten camp there that has been resisting the Pacific Trail pipeline, which Chevron is a 50% owner of and is also a key stakeholder in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the El Sapagtag in New Brunswick has been resisting fracking by this company called SWN Resources. And just yesterday, the SWN, after much violence visited upon them, but very strong direct action and resistance, SWN has withdrew from their land and is withholding all projects until 2015 at least, so minor victories there. And right now, Portland Rising Tide is supporting the tribes of the Umatilla and Warm Springs tribes and resisting the shipment of tar sands equipment through East Oregon right now, which was successfully blocked by the Nez Perce in Idaho recently. They were able to also get a court injunction to prevent that. So it looks like my time's up, but yeah. So it's important in summary in resisting the TPP and to kind of adequately address climate change, that we're also creating the relationships and the systemic change that we want to see on the land and very directly.
Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Good afternoon to everyone here. I want to first thank the organizers of this event and thank the David and Mike for their comments, for teaching us a little bit and setting the groundwork. I want to continue with what Reverend Santos Lyons was talking about. On November 8th, the sort of largest and strongest super typhoon internationally called Haiyan or Yolanda hit the central Philippines. An island called Samar was where landfall hit, where 195 miles per hour winds sort of, really devastated the lives and livelihood of Filipinos in the central region of the country. Growing up in the Philippines, I understand that the Philippines is a typhoon-prone country. It's definitely in that part of the world. However, the devastation that was really destroying. You know, you probably saw the images. By a show of hands, how many folks saw images of the destruction? Absolutely. It displaced tens and thousands of people. The death toll continues to rise. There is definitely sitios and barangays, villages and towns that are not able to continue the sort of process of living, right? There's a lot of internal migration happening in the Philippines. People in central Philippines going to the nearest cities and then even to Manila. And I think for me, when the weeks where our TVs and our newspapers were flooded with those images of just destruction, it reminded me of Hurricane Katrina, it reminded me of Haiti, it reminded me of the ways in which disaster is hard. It was heavy for me, and I'm sure for a lot of other folks. And the question that came up for me was how much of this natural disaster was natural, right? And how much of it was man-made. And this is where I want to sort of go today, to bring sort of the victims of the typhoon here in the room with us, and also bring the sort of resistance happening currently around responding to this. I mean, we're talking about the free trade agreements in Bali just in the past couple of days. The WTO met, and the People's Global Camp, counteraction to these discussions, we're also conversing with people's organizations and acting people-to-people solidarity to talk about the urgent needs of people and communities today. So I want to move towards that question: how much of this disaster was man-made? In the rest of my time. In the Philippines, the National Liberation Movement has a sort of slogan talking about land is life, right? And really why they are referring to land as life in this way is that the Philippines, you know, an archipelago of 7,000 islands, has super arable soil, right? Lots of volcanoes underneath the islands, making that soil really rich. There's also huge natural and mineral resources in the Philippines. It's second in gold production worldwide, third in copper production. However, there's been a tremendous loss of biodiversity on the land and waters, reducing sort of the sustainability and livelihood of marine and sort of land cultures, right? Deforestation, actually the top sort of ecological problem in the Philippines right now, really has been wrought since the 1960s, and even before then, I could even argue, you know, through Spanish colonization, but really around the turn to neoliberalism for the Philippines. Foreign corporate firms and really big Philippine land-owning partners that happen to be Philippine politicians have really expanded the ability of foreign corporations to come in and do a lot of mining. For example, the Mining Act of 1995 allowed, it was a policy that instead of just tolerating sort of foreign ownership and foreign mining interests in the Philippines, actually promoted sort of foreign and large-scale mining for quote-unquote economic growth and the alleviation of rural poverty in some of the Philippines, some of the islands in the Philippines. Xstrata, a recent sort of example, Xstrata, a corporation that's mining in South Cotabato, which is an area in sort of the central and southern Philippines, are trying to mine for gold and copper deposits. And with that mining means displacement, actually. And so some things that you were saying, Mike, totally resonate with these examples. The Pallesen tribe has been forced to clear their land because of this kind of large-scale mining. And in actuality, this sort of U.S., Philippine, and, you know, as you were saying earlier, David, that, you know, the multinational corporation is king now, the sort of collaborative imperialist sort of interest that's happening in the Philippines also causes lots of human rights violations. Indigenous people from the Pallesen tribe were organizing around stopping these large-scale mining, and, you know, Juvie and Dagil Capion, their 2 sons and 5-year-old daughter, were massacred because they were leading a lumad. Lumad is the indigenous people of that area. They were leading organizing strikes against the mining corporation, and they were massacred because of the disruptions, the direct actions that they were trying to take against this mining corporation. I'm stating these sort of examples because I would really like to highlight that the breadth and the intensity of the destruction wrought by flooding and natural disasters is actually not just about climate, right? Well, it is, okay, I just want to say that it is about climate, but it's also about the policies that support the disempowerment and dispossession of people and their right to life, right? Their right to their land, right? I mean, I think that continuously in the central Philippines and in the southern Philippines, the denudation of forests, the destruction of watersheds, the massive siltation of rivers really make it such that when flooding happens, right, when you kind of see deforestation happening, you see that when rains come down, there's nothing to absorb that water. And when rivers are silted, there's nothing to sort of you know, absorb the rainwater that's coming down on the land. I also, you know, I'm a recent transplant to Portland, and I know that Oregon is a timber industry sort of state, correct? Yes? Can I get some head nods? Yes, okay. One time my husband and I were driving to the Oregon coast and saw just like massive cutting down of trees, right? And it made me think of the Philippines and what would happen if a typhoon would strike, you know, heavy rains would strike down here, and imagining what that meant for people who didn't have time to evacuate their villages, their homes, right? I also want to point to government accountability in the Philippines. The Philippines government under the President Noynoy Aquino right now has been exposed for pork barrel scandals, this basic mismanagement and misappropriation of public funds. They, as you may have heard, were slow to respond to relief and rehabilitation in the Philippines. And much of this is, you know, linking it to the TPPA, I think the Philippines sort of wanting to be part of the TPPA and wanting to be a player in the global economy is really about just abandoning responsibilities to the public interest and sort of trying to get, this sort of get rich quick schemes, right? Around the TPPA, the free trade agreements. And I want to link this because I think that the Philippines continues to be sort of the next growing semi-industrial economy in the Philippines, but on the global stage it looks nice and pretty, right? But on the ground, the view from the ground is not so pretty, right? There was no disaster prevention program. In 2012, the budget for that actually even came down a little, lowered because of Aquino's sort of shift to more public-private partnerships and sort of going towards free trade agreements and pursuing a sort of neoliberal agenda. And this is heavily influenced by the US and Philippines, the neo-colonial relationship that is is driving Philippine politics to this day. The Philippine government and under sort of what Hillary Clinton calls America's Pacific Century, the Philippines is a key player here. And not only is it because of the natural resources of the Philippines, but because geopolitically it's a strategic country to be occupying, right? And the Philippine government is sort of taking lead from the US. They're definitely wanting the TPPA to come in. But what I would like to say is that the TPPA will only worsen the current conditions of the Filipino people to this day. If there's nothing else you can remember from this rant, right, is that that the TPPA will really trouble national sovereignty for the Philippines, and it will produce really horrendous and continuing worsening conditions for the Filipino people. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Pallesen. I'm the Vice President and Political Director of the Association of Western Pulp and Paper Workers Union. And we represent people mostly in forest-related jobs in the paper industry. So I'm curious today, how many people here have used paper products, let's say in the last 7 days? Can I see a show? Okay. Maybe in the last 24 hours. Let's try to narrow this down. How many have not used paper products in the last 24 hours? And as you said, Oregon and the Pacific Northwest is known as, forest related. And we all know, including myself, how controversial logging and the issues related to forestry are. And should be, because this country has developed some of the best, most stringent logging practices in the world. And yet, trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership wipe those out as we go on. So I want to use the paper industry as an example of what has happened, not just to the paper industry, but throughout manufacturing in the United States. You know, a lot of us, we don't want things in our backyard, right? We want it done elsewhere, and then we shift that responsibility. And so in Oregon and in the Pacific Northwest, we have fewer paper mills, fewer lumber mills and sawmills than we've ever had in the last 75 years. And yet demand for certain products within those is as high as it is, or as high as it's ever been. And many of the products, of course, now are imports and come in from other countries. The biggest reason for this is multinational corporations. There are hardly any small or medium-sized pulp or paper operations or logging operations in the United States. It's multinational corporations that are really kind of scamming the system, and I'll give you a couple examples of that. So Oregon's known as a great recycle city, right? Which is fantastic. Recovered waste paper is one of the big issues or big things that are recycled. The Blue Heron Paper Mill in Oregon City closed in 2011. It was a 100% recovered waste paper mill. And yes, it's an ugly facility. Most all manufacturing facilities are not pretty. But yet they retooled over the years to produce paper products that were in high demand using 100% recovered waste paper. They filed bankruptcy in 2011, went out of business, even though they had orders for the next year. One of the main reasons that there's a number of reasons that play into it, but one of the main reasons they filed bankruptcy was they could not afford to continue to purchase recovered waste paper. Even though there was enough supply in the Pacific Northwest, especially the Portland area, to do that. So the reason they could not continue to purchase recovered waste paper is a commodity. And for the most part, China sets the price of what you pay. And China has tremendous illegal subsidies that they're able to continue to do, even though these trade agreements that are supposed to prevent these subsidies from happening, they happen, and in part because the multinational corporations, Georgia Pacific, International Paper, Weyerhaeuser, and the list goes on, are the ones that are investing overseas and investing in China. And so there's not an interest to pursue enforcement of the trade agreements that are there, of the language that is, and the ones that are there that should protect us. I find it a little hard to believe that 70% of recovered waste paper in the United States is exported. 70%. That's so what we're really doing in many ways is we're making the environment worse. So we have politicians that will pass and push for strong environmental laws here, and labor laws, and laws that protect us. The MTB example is a prime one. And so politicians will push for these strong laws here, and yet they'll say, here, go to China, or go somewhere else, or go to anywhere, South America, and you don't have to abide by those. And many of these trade agreements simply have an environmental clause that says, as a country, you have to have environmental regulations. They don't play even on what's there. On the mills that have closed, and I could go through a list, and I'll give you some examples. Weyerhaeuser in North Bend years ago closed. That equipment is now in Taiwan, producing the same products that we made here. Boise, St. Helens, Oregon had a pulp mill. The pulp mill's closed, that equipment's been dismantled, sent overseas, producing the same products we have here. International Paper in Albany was, again, this International Paper, that was a profitable mill. We know that, we represent the workers there, and we had profit sharing. They closed that mill and another one in the South, and that equipment, again, was dismantled and shipped overseas. I worked for Weyerhaeuser in Longview, Washington. Two huge multi-million-dollar paper machines that were there were closed, one in 2001 and one in 2004. And every time these closures happen, most of the companies mostly have the same announcement, low demand for the product, and that these mills, the equipment, cannot compete on the world market. It's propaganda. The mill I worked at had gone through a $30 million retool rebuild about a year and a half before they closed it. And they worked the tax breaks in the systems through the trade agreements and through the US to be able to do this. And as we speak today, the two multi-million-dollar paper machines that Weyerhaeuser claimed could not compete on the world market are producing the very same products they made here, but they're in China. And give you another example on the tax system and what happens, and then the impact on jobs in the area. A few years ago, there was what's called black liquor tax, and I won't go through it, it's fairly complex, but mills burn what's called biomass and black liquor to produce energy for the manufacturing system. And a combination of 2009 and 2010, International Paper alone received a little over $3 billion in tax credits because they were burning what's considered biomass. Black liquor, they'd add biodiesel to it. It was unintended tax break, but they worked the system. So, and understand this is just one company, International Paper, Weyerhaeuser, Georgia Pacific, all of them did this. So in a 2-year time period, they had over $3 billion in tax breaks, claiming they needed that to keep the US industry afloat, claiming they needed the, in order to keep jobs here. At the same time, they did a $4 billion investment in Indonesia, $2 billion investment in Russia, bought 15 mills in China, and have expanded elsewhere. So, they work the system. They say that in order to compete, they need these tax breaks and different things in the trade agreements, and really it's a scam job. And as I said, not only do the jobs leave, but the equipment and manufacturing facilities themselves are completely dismantled and moved overseas. So, kind of end with this. You hear a lot about the national deficit, right? How many of you hear much about the trade deficit? Yeah, and so I'm gonna use the states and the counties as an example. Forget about the national deficit for a minute. Most of the states in our country are broke. Many of the counties are broke, especially rural counties and rural areas. So have the state governments and the rural and county governments grown so huge that they've consumed our tax dollars? The answer is clearly no. So why have they lost the tax base, the tax dollars to support education, and everything they need? It's because of two main reasons. Tax breaks to the rich, and we've lost our tax base because we've lost our jobs of offshoring. That's the loss of jobs and the tax base is one of the main reasons we have a national deficit, along with 2 wars, and I won't get into that part. But, so it's really detrimental on rural communities especially. And as I said, as controversial as most all manufacturing is, the United States has the most stringent laws in the world, and we ought to encourage manufacturing here and do things. We do it the best, the cleanest, the most responsible way there is, and continue these jobs. China now produces more paper products than anybody in the world. And believe it or not, China is worried about India because there's been this shift of manufacturing. It went to Canada, then it went to Mexico, then it's gone to the Asian countries, and now it's going to India. Cheap labor, hardly any environmental laws, hardly any labor laws. And these trade agreements allow for that to happen. And as I said with our politicians, to me, there's such hypocrites, so many of them, that will push for strong laws here and then sign trade agreements that absolutely wipe those out. And so you're creating, all this damage, and especially, as you said, on the environmental side, and it's shameful.
This forum really could not be more timely because as we speak, there are TPP negotiators meeting in Singapore to hash out the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The U.S. Trade Representative is really pushing hard to complete a deal, regardless of how it's going to impact, how it's going to devastate, actually, workers across borders, making it easier for corporations to shift jobs to wherever labor is cheapest or environmental regulations are the weakest. Or the devastating impact it'll have on environmental policies that we need now to combat climate change so that we can prevent the next mega typhoon, so that we don't see another devastation as we did in the Philippines. Or the attacks on our democracy, taking the power to influence public policies to protect public health or safety, or in the Philippines, the right to protect their land. And they're taking it away from people and the communities and putting it directly into the hands of corporations. When asked why the TPP was so secret, why people could not see what's being negotiated in our names, the U.S. Trade Representative said that if people knew what was in it, it could never be passed. So while the U.S. Trade Representative is hell-bent on being able to announce a final deal at these negotiations in Singapore, it's very unlikely that they can finish it in such short time. However, it's very clear that they are going to be bullying countries to make huge concessions. And the US negotiators have already backed away from their very weak environmental regulations. So this is clearly going to be a step in the wrong direction. They're expecting to do a framework announcement, which will be a bravado announcement saying that they all agree. We're not there yet, but we're getting close. For those of you who have been in the TPP fight for some time, you know that fast track is the linchpin in defeating the TPP. Fast track's federal legislation that limits congressional authority over trade policy making. And it does that by eliminating the regular debate and amendment procedures. So If we stop fast track, it'll virtually be impossible for the TPP to be approved. On the flip side, if fast track is granted, then it's going to be really difficult for us to stop the TPP. Because of the amazing work done by many of you in the room here, we've had a lot of success. We were able to get every one of Oregon's House Democrats to sign on to a letter opposing fast track. And you know, they were opposing fast track legislation from 2002. It expired in 2007. And if we can keep it dead, then we have a really good chance of stopping the TPP. Across the country, 151 Democrats opposed fast track, and 27 Republicans also signed on to letters. Now that is a strong show of opposition, so it'd be very difficult to get fast track through. Unfortunately, our opposition are not taking the hint. Instead, they're mobilizing. So we are going to have to do the same, and we're going to have to fight back hard. But the work that we've done is really proof of the power of collective organizing. And I want to remind everyone that we have huge victories in the trade justice movement under our belt. When we organized between environmental groups, between labor, between human rights organizations, back in 1999 in Seattle, we shut down the World Trade Organization. That's right. Thanks, Greg. And then when we organized across borders, we shut down the free trade area of the Americas. And I have no doubt that if we work together, we can stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership too. Thank you.